If you check back tomorrow, that might be over 20,000. And that is really only a small inkling of the impact that his work has had, because a lot of the impact has also come through the software packages that he's worked on, and that I'm sure we'll see some of today as well. I could go on for the entire hour and take all of Randy's time. I will not do that. So with that, Randy, thank you very much for being our inaugural speaker.
Okay, great. Before we start, I've gotten several messages popping up saying people are trying to join and it's full, so they can't. So maybe someone should send out an email to that list just saying it's full, but we'll be trying to record it. Okay, let's see. I'll try to show my screen now. Is that working? Can you see the slides?
We can.
Okay, great. So yeah, this is an experiment, this online seminar, so by all means feel free to let us know if there are problems as we go along. It can be informal. If you have questions as I go along, feel free to unmute your mic and ask a question. I'd be happy to have some feedback as I go along. I'm sitting here alone in my office and I can't see you anymore, so it'd be good to know that people are out there. So don't hesitate to ask questions if you want to. So I wanted to kind of briefly describe some of the work we've been doing here on tsunami warning and probabilistic hazard assessment, and kind of it's going to be sort of a smorgasbord of different things, but hopefully various things that are of interest on some of the new algorithms we've been looking at. So this picture on the first slide shows what's called the Cascadia subduction zone, which is an earthquake subduction zone where the oceanic plates are subducting beneath the continental plates. And these are the sort of subduction zones that give rise to the big magnitude 9 earthquakes that cause tsunamis out in the ocean, like we've seen recently in Japan and Chile and the Indian Ocean and other places. So there's a lot of interest in the Northwest and at UW in particular in modeling these sort of subduction zones. The other figures here are sort of the first 4 eigenmodes of the Cascadia subduction zone, if you will, and later in the talk I'll sort of explain what that's all about. Let's see. So there's a huge number of people who've been involved in this over the years, and I haven't tried to list everybody, but what I'll be talking about is modeling we were doing with what's called the GeoClaw software, which is part of FlawPack, which is an open source package I've been working on for 20 years or so now for solving hyperbolic PDEs in general. And about 10 years ago, David George, when he was a student here, started working on tsunami modeling with that, and that's what grew into this GeoClaw package. It's now being used for a variety of other applications, storm surge, landslides, many other things. But I'm going to focus mostly on tsunami modeling and hazard assessment, and there's a number of people here at UW and elsewhere that we've been working on with these projects, which I'll mention more as we go along. So as I mentioned, these big tsunamis are often caused by these subduction zone earthquakes. So the idea is that as this denser oceanic plate is subducting beneath the lighter continents, it doesn't slide nice and easily. It sticks for decades or centuries at a time, and as it's sticking, it's kind of deforming the continental plate above it and building up more and more stress along the interface, and then eventually enough stress builds up that it ruptures and it slips, and at that point the continental plate relaxes back downwards, the seaward plate rises up typically, that lifts up the ocean above it, injects a huge amount of potential energy into the ocean that then the surface disturbance propagates away in the form of tsunamis. And the speed at which the waves propagate over the ocean it's well modeled by the shallow water equations, which is what we primarily use for modeling them. And so the propagation speed is the square root of gh, where g is the gravitational constant, h is the depth of the ocean, which is like 4,000 meters on average. So that translates into a wave speed of 400 miles an hour or so. And then, of course, as it comes onto a continental shelf, it will tend to shorten up and turn into a much deeper amplitude wave that comes in and does a lot of damage. So I do have one animation here of sort of how this subduction process leads to uplift of the seafloor. This is some work I'm doing with Chris Vogel, who's here that I'll mention later, but actually looking at seismic modeling rather than tsunami modeling. So the bottom picture here shows a little slit here, which is a rupture surface. And what happens is we're assuming the upper plate is sliding some amount to the left, the lower plate is sliding to the right, and the colors here are sort of the stress, the trace of the stress tensor actually. So red means compression, blue means extension. And then what happens as it deforms is that you get seismic waves that propagate away. And what's shown on the top is the surface here. So this is going down to 200 kilometers depth, and this earthquake fault is, starts 15 kilometers below the seafloor, say. The deformation is what's shown in blue here. Initially, there's no deformation. The red curve, I'll talk about in a moment, but for the moment, watch the blue curve. As these waves start to propagate outwards, you get some deformation of the surface, and you get these surface waves that propagate away, and all of the seismic waves propagate away. And eventually, it sort of converges to some deformation of the surface, which is what this red curve was showing. But the red curve was actually computed not by solving the seismic wave equations, but by using what's called the Okada model, which is a sort of Green's function solution to an elastic half-space problem with a dislocation along a surface like this. And it just gives us sort of directly from the slit along the fault surface, it tells us what the long-term steady state displacement of the surfaces. So in practice, as we play this again, you get these seismic waves, and so there's some disturbance in the surface, but that's actually moving at a much faster speed than a tsunami would be. So the tsunami is really primarily generated by this long-term static deformation of the seafloor. However, the reason we're developing a seismic code is because there's some cases where there's much more coupling of the ocean and the seismic waves, and also the real ocean doesn't have a flat surface. It has typically very steep topography near the continental slope and whatnot. So we're trying to come up with a better approximation than this Okada model. But the Okada model is what's typically used in tsunami modeling. So yeah, as I mentioned, we have this Cascadia subduction zone that runs all along the west coast. And it's now known from looking at geological evidence in the Northwest, also historical records in Japan, for example, that the last big magnitude 9 earthquake was on January 26, 1700. So the precise dates and, in fact, the time, about 9 p.m., is known from records in Japan. Created a big enough tsunami to do a lot of damage there. And along the coast, they found records of many past tsunamis that they can date. The tsunami brings in sand and other sediment and drops it on shore. That gets left behind and covered up with soil that builds up over the centuries, and then another tsunami comes in and lays down another layer of deposits. And so by digging down in various places, they can find something like 19 or 20 big events over the last 10,000 years. So that's where this figure of every 500 years on average comes from, but there's a big variance. So it could be any time that we have the next big event like this. So let me show you just one tsunami simulation of what might happen if a magnitude 9 happens here offshore. This, of course, is the Olympic Peninsula, Vancouver Island up here. So initially, you get this uplift. So red here is uplift above the original sea level. Blue is subsidence below the original sea level. The scale here is in meters, and it's sort of saturating at 8 meters. So a big disturbance initially that's spread out over a very large area. 1 degree is about 100 kilometers. And then that generates waves that propagate and hit the coastline within 20 or 30 minutes, and also gives a wave that comes into Puget Sound, and there's some areas in the Sound that can get severely damaged by a tsunami, even when coming from the ocean. Of course, we also have the Seattle Fault, which runs right across Puget Sound, and various other faults in Puget Sound itself, so there's potential for more localized tsunamis as well. So there's a lot of interest in Washington State in preparing better for tsunamis and better understanding what's going on. Maybe I'll pause for a second and see if there are any questions or any problems out there that we should deal with. Okay, so another area in particular that we've looked at along the Washington coast is ocean shores and Westport, which are basically very low-lying sandbars at the entrance of Grays Harbor on the Washington coast. These are sandbars that were deposited over thousands of years from sand coming out of the Columbia River primarily, I think. So they're very low-lying. And what happens if you have a magnitude 9 offshore in this area is that within about 20 minutes after the earthquake, this is the time up here, 25 minutes, the waves are starting to reach these peninsulas. Potentially, if it's a bad enough earthquake, it could sweep over both of these peninsulas, more or less. Again, this is 5 meters of water, although this is saturated. I think someone has their microphone out there. Perhaps you can do it. So this particular study we were doing, in particular looking at this area down here that's circled in blue, there's an elementary school here that was just recently rebuilt, the Acosta Elementary School. This is a little hard to see, but this is kind of the maximum flow depth over the course of that whole tsunami peninsula. Luckily, the school, and there's also a high school here, are on a sort of ridge that runs along the east side of the Westport Peninsula that's somewhat protected by some other ridges. And so in this particular simulation, I think that you get quite a bit of water west of that. Sorry, I'm just going to mute some people who seem to be coming through here. If you're not asking a question, please mute your microphones. Thanks. So what's shown down the bottom here is sort of a cross-section, a transect through where this school is that shows, again, the maximum flow depth with a very exaggerated vertical scale compared to the horizontal. So what looks like mountains here are really little ridges of the sandbar that go up at most 12 meters or so above sea level. And the blue here is the maximum depth of the water, which goes up to about 13 meters or so above sea level. And so along the coast, it's going to be very deep water. Fortunately, where the school complex is, this particular simulation didn't show any flooding. But if you assume that these ridges might get washed out a bit and do a simulation that doesn't have the ridges in there by modifying the topography, which we've also done, then you do in fact get some flooding at the school site. Not too much, but certainly some. And moreover, on this peninsula, there's really not time to get off the peninsula or get to high ground for most of the residents of this peninsula. So when they rebuilt this elementary school, which just opened this fall, they built it as what's called a vertical evacuation structure, the first one that's been built on the US coastline, although there's several in Japan and other places already. But this is the first one that people have come up with funding for on the Washington coast. So the new school has a gymnasium that's a 2-story tall building with a tsunami safe area on the top. And this is an artist's rendition of what it might look like if a tsunami came there with, I think there's capacity for more than 1,000 people on the roof. And there's stairwells on the 4 corners that are open or accessible 24/7, so people could use this facility if necessary. Now, none of our simulations showed this much flooding there, so we hope it will never get used in exactly this way, but that's sort of the idea. If you're interested in hearing more about this, there's a really good video about this, what's called Project Safe Haven, which is a Washington State project to design a number of other vertical evacuation structures along the coast, and also about sort of the community effort to pass a bond issue to support building this evacuation structure. Yeah, so going into the math a bit more, shallow water equations, as I mentioned, is actually a pretty good model, at least for tsunamis propagating across the ocean. The ocean may not seem shallow, but compared to the wavelength of one of these big tsunamis, it is. The wavelength can be several hundred kilometers, whereas the depth is 4 or 5 kilometers, perhaps. So luckily, we can use these 2-dimensional depth averaged equations rather than having to use full 3-dimensional modeling. We've been looking at some 3-dimensional modeling for very localized areas, working with Mike Motley and one of his students in civil and environmental engineering who've been doing some modeling of flow around structures in particular. But for the most part, we use two-dimensional shallow water equations. So H is the depth of the fluid, HU and HV are the momenta in the two different horizontal directions. This 1/2 GH squared is the hydrostatic pressure. And then the right-hand side here are source terms that come from the varying topography or bathymetry, which is underwater topography. And the gradient of the bathymetry kind of comes in as a forcing term in the momentum equations. And there's a number of numerical issues here, which I'm not really going to try to get into in this talk, but in developing a robust algorithm for solving these equations, there's a lot of things that come into it. In particular, if you just think about an ocean at rest where the velocities are all zero and the surface is flat, then most of the terms drop out of these equations. The time derivatives drop out, everything involving a u or a v drops out. What you're left with is the 1/2 GH squared differentiated with respect to x on the left and this minus GH dv dx on the right. And if it were a flat bottom, those would also drop out. But if you have varying topography, then you have terms on the right-hand side that have to exactly balance terms on the left-hand side in order to maintain that steady state ocean at rest. So one of the tricky things in designing algorithms is to make sure they maintain that steady state and can properly model very small perturbations to that steady state, because the tsunami, again, is out in the deep ocean. It might be less than a meter amplitude, but a very long wavelength, but it's on top of a depth of 4,000 or 5,000 meters. Also, we want to model inundation and what happens when the flow comes on shore. And so really we're solving this, even though it's two-dimensional equation, it's two-dimensional equations in a domain with boundaries that are moving as the water moves in or out. And we don't try to solve a boundary value problem with a moving boundary, though, especially because the boundary can become very complicated and you can have islands appear or lakes left behind as the water retreats or whatnot. So instead what we do is we just use a purely Cartesian grid, latitude, longitude space everywhere. And we use finite volume methods where the things that we're keeping track of are the cell averages of the depth and the momenta. And so a cell that's dry simply has H equals 0. A cell that's wet has H positive. And in every time step, a cell can change from wet to dry. So that means you have to have special ways of handling or discretizing the differential equations at these interfaces between wet and dry cells. So we use what are called high-resolution finite volume methods, shock capturing methods that are based on solving Riemann problems at cell interfaces and then applying limiters to capture discontinuity as well. There's a whole sort of methodology that's been developed and that's implemented in this more general clawback package, which I won't talk about too much here, but it's important to handle all of that well. And then the other thing that I will say a little bit about is the adaptive mesh refinement, that even though it's only in 2 space dimensions, it's really important, we think, to use adaptive refinement to come up with a efficient method, because we have very different length scales. We might be propagating a tsunami all the way across the ocean, and then we want to zoom in on one community at a resolution of 10-meter grid cells. And we can't use that kind of grid resolution over a very large region, even in 2D. And as the wave propagates across the ocean, we'd like to zoom in more on where the wave is and not have a bunch of cells in regions that we don't care about. So here's just one example sort of how the adaptive refinement works. This is the Tohoku 2011 tsunami. That was the name of the event off the coast of Japan in 2011. This was devastating in Japan, but that tsunami reached many other places. This was a test problem from a benchmarking workshop last year to compare against some gauges in a harbor entrance in New Zealand. So this is New Zealand down here. This is Australia at a very coarse resolution. Japan is up here. It doesn't even appear because the resolution is so coarse. But this is at 15.5 hours after the earthquake. But at this time, what we're zooming in on is the North Island of New Zealand, and then right in this area on the right-hand side is this bay that had a very narrow entrance here where there were some gauges that measured the tsunami as it came in. So the benchmark problem was to compare simulations with what had been measured at those gauges. So this sort of simulation down to like a 10-meter resolution over this entire bay area can be done on a laptop. In this case, it took about 3.5 hours on a quad-core laptop using OpenMP for parallelization, which is built into our code. But if we look at sort of how the grids behaved over time, if we go back to only 3 hours after the earthquake, then we weren't resolving New Zealand at all. It pretty much disappeared here. But we are resolving Japan still, and these rectangles are actually patches, refined patches. So each rectangle is like a 60 by 60 grid or less of cells at some resolution. So we start with a very coarse grid over the whole ocean where nothing is happening. This is North America up here, Australia here. And then as the wave propagates, the regions that we're refining can move so that we're following the waves that we care about, in this case the ones headed for New Zealand. We're not bothering to resolve the waves that were heading towards North America in this case. And as it goes along, we refine regions that are only the regions that are sort of important on reaching New Zealand. And because we have a relatively small refined area, and also we're not really refining very much in this area compared to the 10-meter resolution we eventually need near this harbor, so far this has only taken about 3 minutes of CPU time. Then as it starts to approach New Zealand, we start to put in higher levels of refinement around New Zealand. We're still not resolving the harbor at all well. But as it approaches closer, we start to refine that area with more levels of refinement. And then 13 hours after the event, we've started refining this down to the full resolution. And to this point, it's taken about 19 minutes of computing time. And then the computing time rapidly goes up once you have this very fine grid over the region you care about. But the computing time is really determined by where you need a fine grid, how large a region, how long a time span you need that. And we don't have to have this fine grid here until we really need it. And we can track the waves as they propagate across the ocean. So that's the idea. And then this harbor entrance here, as I mentioned, there were some gauges. So this next picture shows kind of a zoom view of that harbor entrance. There was a beacon out here where they recorded the sea surface, and also a tide gauge in here that recorded the sea surface. And then at the entrance here, there was a ADCP, acoustic Doppler current profiler, that was actually measuring the velocity of the water as it went in and out of the harbor. And on the right here is just some comparisons of the actual measurements after removing the tide going up and down. The measurements are in black, and the geoclaw simulation is in red at these points. And the top two are the surfaces at this point and the tide gauge. The bottom three are showing the velocities here. The first two show the east-west and north-south components of velocity, and then the total speed. Turns out it's much harder to capture velocities well in the tsunami model than surface elevation because it varies much more spatially. You can just think about it across this entrance. The surface elevation as a wave comes in here might be pretty constant, but the velocities could be very different, especially if you get vortices forming and boundary layer effects near the edges and whatnot. So from one point to a nearby point, you can have very big changes in the velocity, even though the surface might be almost the same. So one thing that a lot of tsunami modeling groups have been working on recently is trying to sort of validate our codes for looking at currents. And currents in harbors are often very damaging, even if a tsunami doesn't come on shore. The currents in the harbors can do a lot of damage to ships and infrastructure. So it's kind of one of the big research areas now, and how to better model currents and interpret data that's coming out of the tsunami models. So there was a benchmarking workshop last February, so specifically on that topic. Okay, so how do we do this adaptive refinement? Well, I'm not going to go into the details of the algorithm, but it uses sort of a block structured approach. It goes back to work of Marcia Berger, Phil Colella, Joe Oliger back in the late 70s, early 80s, and Marcia Berger has been sort of working on the AMR part of ClawPack for the last 20 years with me, and working on the GeoClaw part now as well. So that means we start with a single sort of coarse grid and then refine patches of it to the next level, and then recursively within those patches, patches are refined to the next level, and you can refine by sort of arbitrary factors from one level to the next. So what I'll talk about a little bit though is how do we flag the cells that need refinement? So in that example we just looked at of the waves going to New Zealand, there were equally big waves that were going off towards Seattle, for example, but we didn't refine those waves at all. So we have ways in the algorithm to say we want to refine only this area and not that area, and sort of specify regions that should be refined to different levels. And of course, it also can just look at the surface elevation in each cell and see whether there's a wave there at all, and we have some tolerance so that if the surface elevation is close enough to sea level, we don't refine it. So you can specify these different ways of sort of flagging a cell at one level for needing refinement, and then those get clustered into patches for refinement at the next level, and then you do that every few time steps so that these regions of refinement can move. But one thing we've been looking at recently that Risa Davis, one of our students here, is working on is looking at using adjoint methods to so those are the methods I mentioned, but the adjoint method is another way to sort of identify the important waves. So in this New Zealand problem, for example, you could put in regions where you kind of explicitly say, here's where I want to be refining in order to capture the wave going towards New Zealand, but that's a little tedious to figure out exactly where to do that. And it can be a little misleading sometimes. You might miss waves that turn out to be important. So let me briefly describe sort of the idea of using an adjoint method. So here's another example. This was a sort of hypothetical earthquake on the Alaska-Aleutian subduction zone. And Crescent City is marked down here. Crescent City, California, is often hard hit by tsunamis because of sort of offshore ridge that acts as a wave guide in part. So we've also been working on probabilistic hazard assessment for Crescent City, so I'll show some of that later. But suppose, for example, we're interested in capturing the waves that are going to reach Crescent City in this particular simulation. So if we run it out, here I'm sort of refining everywhere that there's waves. And what we see is that, at 3 hours after the earthquake, there's some waves that are moving up here. The water is much shallower up here, so they're moving much slower. But if we're interested in Crescent City, we really don't need to be resolving those waves at all. Also, there's a big part of the wave energy is kind of going straight south, seems to be going away from Crescent City, so we might think we don't need to refine those waves at all, and really all we have to worry about is this part of the wave that's headed right towards Crescent City. Okay, but if we run it out a little further, what we see is that at this point, Hawaii appears here. We refined well enough. And from the Hawaiian Islands, there's the Leeward Island chain that runs along here, which is a kind of a very long underwater ridge that acts as a reflector. And so at later times, what happens is you get a reflected wave off of that that comes back and eventually hits Crescent City too. And there are also edge waves that propagate up and down along the continental shelf here where the water is shallower, and you can get interactions between the edge waves and these reflected waves that in some cases can give you a bigger wave than the first arrival even. There's been many cases where the worst tsunami wave was not the first one to arrive. So if you were only sort of thinking about refining directly between where the source was in Crescent City, you might miss some of this. And if you're, on the other hand, want to try to capture everything by refining everywhere, then your simulation runs much slower. So it's nice to be able to have a method that kind of automatically identifies where the important waves are. So this is a synthetic tide gauge at Crescent City for a simulation like this that shows, in this case, this wave here that arrived 11 hours after the event was much larger than the one that first arrived. So very brief introduction to adjoint methods for time-dependent problems. So let's look at just a really simple linear hyperbolic equation in one space dimension. So the time derivative of some vector q plus some coefficient matrix times dq dx equals 0 over some time interval. And suppose that we don't really necessarily care about the full solution in x and t, but we care about something that we can represent as a functional of the solution. For example, an integral of some function v hat of x, some specified function, times the solution at some particular time t. So this is a linear function that returns a scalar value that depends on this whole solution. So for example, if we only care about the solution at one point in space, like Crescent City, at one particular time, then that would be our t final, and this v hat function we could take to be a delta function in space centered at the gauge location that we care about. If we were looking at, say, linearized shallow water equations in one dimension, we might have a depth and a velocity component. So maybe it's just this vector that we're interested in, looking at the depth at this one particular point in space and one particular point in time. So the idea in an adjoint method is, let's look for a function v of xt. So this v hat of x was just a function given to us or chosen by us as only a function of x. But let's sort of extend that to some function v of xt, so that this functional phi can also be evaluated by taking the inner product of v at some earlier time t with q at that earlier time. Okay? So if we could do that, then we could use the solution at some earlier time together with this adjoint function, if we can figure out what it is, to evaluate what we care about without even having to solve the problem the rest of the way. And in particular, that would tell us also what parts of the solution at this time are going to be important in the thing we finally care about. Because if q is large at some point, but the adjoint function is small at that same point, then in this inner product, that's going to drop out and be less important. So this can help us identify what regions do we want to refine. So the way to find this adjoint function is to take the original equation, multiply by the transpose of this function we're looking for, vt, and then integrate in both space and time. And since the differential equation had 0 on the right-hand side, when we integrate 0, we're going to get 0. And then just integrate by parts. Integrate the term that involves the time derivative, integrate by parts in time, and the term that involves the x derivative, integrate in parts by parts in x. And what you do, if you do that and you choose appropriate boundary conditions, so those terms drop out, what you end up with, well, the boundary conditions in space drop out, but the boundary conditions in time, when you integrate by parts in time, you get exactly what we want, that the integral of v transpose q at the final time, which is the functional we're looking for perhaps, is equal to that same inner product at some earlier time, but then plus this term that comes from integrating by parts. So it now involves the derivatives of v and a transpose. But we can make this vanish by choosing our adjoint function to satisfy vt plus a transpose vx equals 0. Okay, so if we just say that's how we're going to define this function, then this integral drops out. And that's a hyperbolic set of differential equations too, as just the transpose of the original coefficient matrix here. And so, of course, we need some initial conditions for that, but what we actually have is final conditions, not initial conditions, namely that at time capital T, we want this v function to be v hat, so that this term here reduces to the functional we're trying to estimate. Okay? So the adjoint equation is a hyperbolic system of pretty much the same type, but it's solved starting at the final time with this function v hat that we imposed as our defining our functional and integrating backwards in time. But by doing that, you can then have a way of combining that with your forward solution at any point in time to estimate your functional or to see what parts of your forward solution are important in calculating the functional well, which is how we use it in guiding adaptive refinement. So this is maybe a good point to see if there are any questions, because this is a very quick and condensed version of how adjoint equations work here. Okay, we'll jump in if you think of a question, please. Yeah, so in this case, if we looked at the problem we were talking about, if we care about the solution at Crescent City, we might start with our initial data for the adjoint being a delta function or a smeared out delta function around Crescent City, and then it turns out the adjoint of the linearized shallow water equations are basically the same equations again, and so we can use basically the same code to solve the adjoint equation backwards in time from the final time. because I don't have the solution here, but these waves will radiate out in exactly the same way as if we had a tsunami starting at Crescent City. They'll bounce off of the Hawaiian Leeward Island chain here, and part of it will, that reflected wave will head back up here, as well as part of the direct wave. And then at some earlier time, we could take the inner product of that with the forward solution. So at this particular time, for example, if we take that inner product, the parts that kind of light up where the inner product is large are basically the direct wave, which is just reaching Crescent City at this particular time, but then also this reflected wave that's still headed towards Crescent City and we'll reach it later. And so on the left is shown a AMR simulation where this adjoint flagging was used to identify what regions we needed to flag. So for example, this wave down here is not being refined. These waves are sort of really are headed away from Crescent City at this point. At least over the time we simulated, they don't generate any reflections that reach Crescent City, but we do refine the reflection pattern. So that's the idea with the adjoint. Yeah, so let me just mention a few other sort of aspects of things we've been looking at. So there's many uses of the model. It's being used for sort of understanding past events, both to calibrate the model, but also to sort of understand where past tsunamis might have happened that give rise to deposits that are found in different places, for example. Of course, tsunami modeling can be used in real-time warning and forecasting. We haven't been directly involved in that. NOAA has a forecasting center where they have their own tsunami model, although we've been talking to them about possibly including GeoGlaw in their software in the future. But one thing we have been looking at a little bit is what's called earthquake early warning and possible applications to tsunami early warning, which I have a slide on in a moment. And then what we've mostly been working on is sort of hazard mapping and hazard mitigation, so things like looking at this Acosta school design. We've also been doing sort of modeling of the coast of Washington for the state for a new generation of tsunami evacuation maps. And we've also been looking at ways of doing probabilistic hazard assessment, which I'll also briefly talk about, where we want to look at not just the worst case, but try to get an idea of sort of probabilistic risks. So just briefly, this earthquake early warning, this is a project that we just got involved in this year, and Chris Vogel, postdoc working with me, is involved in this too, and some of the seismic modeling that we're doing is directly related to this project. So the idea is that if an earthquake happens, it's very hard to predict earthquakes in the future, but once one has started to happen, maybe you can predict how bad it's going to be or get some warning that if it's going to be bad. So the idea is an earthquake generates both P waves and S waves, the shear waves, which move slower, and surface waves, which are concentrated near the surface that move even slower than the S wave. And so if you can detect the P wave quickly, and if you have sensors that can sort of record it for a long enough period that you're pretty sure it's going to turn into a bad earthquake, or that it's not just a small tremor, but something that's really dangerous, then you can potentially send a warning out that arrives 30 seconds to a couple of minutes before the dangerous surface waves arrive, which doesn't seem like much time, but if you have things automated, you can do a lot in a few seconds. So for example, in California, they have a system like this that's being put into place that's connected with the BART trains, so that when an earthquake happens, the BART trains can stop. And high-speed rails in Japan have the same sort of system. All sorts of other things you might think about doing in emergency rooms of hospitals or operating rooms to turn on emergency generators and to warn doctors that they should get the scalpel away from the patient before the strong shaking starts and whatnot. So there's lots that could potentially be done with early warning based on these waves. So in Japan, they have an offshore cable of sensors that runs along the continental shelf here. Japan is in white over here. This is the offshore. And so they collect a lot of information, and that's part of their early warning system. And I think in 2011, there was actually about 90 seconds warning in Tokyo before the worst waves arrived. So this sort of thing does work, but it's very expensive. It costs hundreds of millions of dollars to put in a cable network like this. So there's a proposal to do something like that on the Cascadia subduction zone, both for early warning and also for just sort of scientific studies of the subduction zone to better understand all the small earthquakes that are always happening, and the sort of the plate tectonics and how things are moving and where stress is building up and whatnot. So there's a project that's funded this year and next year by the Moore Foundation to kind of design a prototype for this that involves a bunch of people from around campus and oceanography, the Applied Physics Lab, Earth and Space Sciences, and Chris Swogel and I are involved in this in sort of looking at whether you could make use of this kind of data also to do a better job of early tsunami warning. Now, if you're right on the coast here in ocean shores, for example, where you have very little time, and if you feel a bad earthquake, you know it's going to be bad, this may not help. But if you're in Puget Sound somewhere where it takes a couple of hours for the waves to reach, and there's just been a bad earthquake, it would be really nice to know whether or not you need to evacuate areas. Evacuation is not going to be easy following a magnitude 9, so you don't want to tell people to evacuate unless they really have to. So we're starting to look at, can we perhaps get more information from having a bunch of nearshore sensors like this. Okay, so finally I wanted to say a little bit about probabilistic hazard assessment, which is another thing we've been looking at a lot. So I mentioned Crescent City, which is here on the California coast, close to the Oregon border. And there's this ridge offshore, as I mentioned, that kind of acts as a waveguide that tends to funnel waves in here. And there's a harbor that kind of helps further funnel it right into the city here. So much of downtown was destroyed in 1964 in the Good Friday earthquake up in Alaska. So they've actually put a park along the shore here. So the main part of downtown is a little farther inland, but it's still definitely in the tsunami inundation zone. There's a small boat harbor here that was extensively damaged in 2011 by the Japanese tsunami. They just rebuilt it, about a $30 million effort there. So this was kind of a study area for a study that FEMA funded a few years ago, and we've got some additional funding from FEMA to keep developing probabilistic tools for this. Now, this is actually a picture from 2011 in this small boat basin, and some of the strong tsunami currents, even though it didn't inundate onshore. So this is the current tsunami evacuation map. I think it's still current for Crescent City. This is the harbor here, but this is the main downtown area, and there's a river valley here that is very low lying. But this is kind of showing the region that might get flooded in one particular type of tsunami, something like the 1964 Alaska. But if you start looking at the wide variety of possible tsunamis that come from different earthquakes from different parts of the world, and even just along the Cascadia subduction zone, you can create very different earthquakes in terms of how much tsunami impact they have in Crescent City. So this is like 4 different realizations, 4 different sample earthquakes out of many that we've looked at in this region. This is an aerial view of Crescent City. Downtown is here. This is the harbor here. This was a smaller Alaska type event where there was very little flooding. This was a model of the 1964 Alaska tsunami, which actually matches pretty well with what the region that was actually flooded in. This is a model of the Tohoku 2011 event, which shows some flooding, but that's because this was run at high tide, at sort of mean sea level plus 97 centimeters above, which is sort of the mean high or high tide. And fortunately, that tsunami actually arrived at low tide, so there was very little flooding, and mostly just damage in the harbor. And then this one down here is a Cascadia subduction zone event, not one of the worst ones, but sort of a typical one of how much flooding you would expect from that. Some of them flood almost the entire region shown here. So another issue that we've looked at that I'm not going to talk about that we've worked on quite a bit, and Lois Adams in particular has worked on methods for dealing with the tidal uncertainty. That for future events, we don't know how bad the earthquake is going to be, but we also don't know whether the waves are going to arrive at low tide and high tide, and that can make a difference. So that has to be sort of incorporated into the probabilistic analysis as well. And so what FEMA was interested in is what they call 100-year flood maps and 500-year flood maps. Those are the things they're required to produce for insurance, setting insurance rates and things like that. So you could view that as being sort of a map of what region do you expect to flood with annual probability 0.01 for the 100-year flood, or 0.002 for the 500-year flood. And so you can sort of develop methods to take the results from lots of different tsunami simulations and combine them together into maps that look like this for the 0.01 probability, or like this for the 0.002 probability. So this is kind of the standard view, and these are created by sort of building up what are called hazard curves at each point that combine the results from all of the different possible tsunamis we've considered with associated probabilities, and also the tidal uncertainty, and allow us to kind of read off for a given probability what level of flooding you expect to see. But you can also kind of turn it around and say, well, for a given level of flooding, what probability do you expect to see that with? And one of the things we kind of struggled with is what are the best ways to present these probabilistic results. So this is a sort of alternative view where you look at what's the probability that you get any flooding at all. And this kind of greenish area here is what you expect to flood with probability about 0.002, so that kind of agrees with this region. But then there's this much bigger region that might flood with much lower probability from some of these more extreme events. Or you could say, well, we really care about water only if it's more than ½ a meter deep, so you can come up with a probability map for that, or 1 meter or 2 meters. As you increase the level, you decrease the region that's at risk. But you see there's large regions of this area where there's at least a very low probability of getting even more than 2 meters of flooding. Let's see, we're running out of time, so I'm going to skip over some of the slides, I think, here on sort of how we build up these hazard curves, for example. But the biggest source of uncertainty in doing any sort of modeling is really the earthquake source, because we don't know what the next earthquake is going to look like. So I'm going to skip over a few slides here. If you're interested, I guess we'll post these slides. If you're interested, there's a set of notebooks that sort of describe how this is done, Jupyter notebooks, that are in a GitHub repository, and that you can also run on the cloud by going to this link. It starts up a cloud instance on a service called Binder. And then the notebooks you can actually go in and play around with. It kind of leads you through how these hazard curves are computed, and has some nice interactive tools. You can click on a point in the city and it pops up the hazard curve for that point, for example. So this was part of a workshop we did last fall. It's part of this M9 project, which is the NSF-funded interdisciplinary project on modeling magnitude 9 earthquakes and tsunamis and landslides and everything else associated with it. Yeah, so there's lots of uncertainties in this, and there's kind of two kinds of uncertainty, as usual. The aleatoric uncertainties, if we know a probability distribution and we're trying to sample it efficiently, and then the epistemic uncertainties that we don't really know what the right probability distribution is that we're trying to sample. And so in terms of looking at future potential earthquakes, we have to deal with both of these. So we have to work with the seismologists. This is really a geophysical problem, this epistemic uncertainty of how you describe properly the probability distribution of future earthquakes. And then if you come up with something that people agree is reasonable, then you have sort of more of a mathematical problem of how do we sample that efficiently, how do we deal with the fact that it may be a very high dimensional space that we're trying to sample, how do we build surrogate models that can be sampled more efficiently and whatnot. So again, I'm going to skip through some of this because we're running out of time, but there's a variety of sort of methods that are commonly used these days in uncertainty quantification that can be applied also to this probabilistic hazard assessment problem. But let me finally just briefly say something about sort of the how would we think about representing a probability distribution of possible earthquakes. So these are slip patterns on subduction zone faults from past events, the Japanese 2011 earthquake and one in Chile 2010. And it just shows that slip is not uniformly distributed. This is Japan over here. This is sort of a top-down view of the fault plane, which is really buried under the earth. But in this case, there was one region of very high slip that happened to be close to the sea floor. And in most of these events, you have a sort of spatial pattern of slip. This is another example of, I think this was another inversion of this 2010 model where the fault surface is split up into rectangles, and then seismologists invert for how much slip there was on each rectangle. Then, of course, what we really need for the tsunami modeling is how the seafloor deforms, and that's where we use this Okada model applied to each of these rectangles to build up a seafloor deformation that goes along with it. So I mentioned that. But what we've been looking at recently is a way to kind of generate random earthquakes by using a carbon-LeVeque expansion, a KL expansion, which is a general technique for generating a random spatial field, a Gaussian field, where the slip, say, on each of these small rectangles on the Cascadia subduction zone is assumed to be a Gaussian distributed random variable, but they're not completely independent. You expect slip in one patch here to be correlated with slip in nearby patches and less correlated with slip farther away. So if you make some assumption about the correlation length, for example, then if you had, say, 600 little fault segments here, you could create a 600 by 600 covariance matrix that you want your random samples to be distributed according to. And then this KL expansion is a way to generate easily random samples that have the right statistics. So that if you generated millions of samples and computed the sample covariance matrix, it would agree well with your desired covariance matrix. And the idea is you simply look at the eigenvalues and eigenvectors of this covariance matrix, and then for a general slip pattern, you take some mean slip on the fault plus a linear combination of these eigenvectors. And so each eigenvector you can think of as representing one slip pattern, and then we're going to take linear combinations of them with coefficients that are independent random numbers that are just normally distributed with mean 0 and variance 1. So we can generate huge numbers of those very easily, and then by plugging it into this KL expansion, it turns out you get slip patterns that have the right covariance structure between different elements of the slip. And you also see the square root of the eigenvalue comes in here, which means that, well, it turns out that if you have a large correlation length, then the eigenvalues tend to decay rapidly, which means you may only need a few terms in this series. So you can generate random slips by choosing sets of random coefficients, but the dimension of the space you're sampling then depends on how many terms you have in the series. If you keep 20 terms, then you've got a 20-dimensional space you're sampling. So the more you can truncate this series, the better. So I won't go through this, I guess, but this just shows that if you do that, then you do, in fact, get the expected covariance matrix. And again, I'm sorry I'm running short on time, but there's some examples here of sort of doing this in one space dimension. But let me show you the more interesting two-dimensional case. So these are the first 4 eigenvectors of that covariance matrix represented as slip patterns. And they look sort of like Fourier modes. And if you look at the higher modes, they get more and more oscillatory. And that corresponds to the fact that the higher modes with smaller eigenvalues correspond to smaller scale structure. And so we can take linear combinations of them. So they're sort of like Fourier modes, but they're shaped to fit the geometry of this fault system that we're looking at. Here's the first 7 modes. If we look at just a smaller part of the fault down near Crescent City is in the center here. We've recently been doing some more detailed studies of random earthquakes down there. And so these are just some random slip patterns and the corresponding seafloor deformation. And these were using 60 terms in the series, and these are the corresponding things if we truncate it to only 7 terms, just to show that you get similar results if you truncate the series in terms of the seafloor deformation and the resulting tsunami. So we've been looking a lot at how much can we truncate these series, and then how can we sample these high-dimensional spaces that we're left with. Yeah, so the big question, though, is kind of the epistemic uncertainty of not really knowing what are the right parameters, what are the right correlation links, and whatnot. So we're still working with the geophysicists, seismologists on that question. Yeah, so there's a bunch of other things going on, continuing to work on various things I mentioned, as well as some other things. Looking at Boussinesq equations, which are also depth-averaged equations, but include higher-order derivatives. Turns out if you look at short wavelength tsunamis, those generated by submarine landslides or by asteroids hitting the ocean, when the wavelength is much shorter, then the shallow water equation assumption isn't so well satisfied, and so you need to use a higher order approximation. But you can still do things with depth averaged equations that are 2-dimensional rather than 3-dimensional. It's more complicated with our AMR, though, because you typically have to use implicit methods for these higher derivative terms, and we're still working on getting that working with the adaptive mesh refinement. So I'll stop there. If you're interested in reading more, these are some on the sort of probabilistic work we've been doing, but geoclaw.org has links to a number of other papers and also a lot of the code that goes along with those papers. We've been trying to sort of archive and share the code and the data that goes along with most of the experiments we've been doing. So I will stop there, but I'm happy to answer questions. Hopefully somebody is still out there.
Let's thank you.
All right, questions?
Randy, this is from WSU Vancouver.
Yeah, I can see you even, yes.
Okay, good. Is the curvature of the Earth at all a factor when, for instance, you're trying to model some event that starts in like Alaska or Japan, and then you're looking at something in New Zealand? Is the curvature of the Earth a factor at all, or is it just flat is good enough?
Yeah, the curvature of the Earth is definitely a factor, and so we are solving the shallow water equations on the surface of the sphere. And so our rectangles, I showed them as sort of flat, but our rectangles are rectangles in latitude, longitude, and there are terms that come in that take into account the curvature and the fact that the rectangles are not exactly rectangular. So that does have to be built in. Another thing that people often ask is, do you have to worry about the Coriolis effects, since we're looking at flow on the sphere, which come from the rotation of the sphere. It turns out for tsunamis, because the fluid velocity as a tsunami goes by is really very tiny out in the deep ocean, Coriolis effects really don't have to be considered. And you can turn them on in GeoClaw, but it makes essentially no difference, so we leave them off.
One more question, kind of tangential. All these models seem to be from the realm of PDEs, but have people tried something totally different to predict, for instance, height of waves at shore, maybe using this whole field of machine learning? So have people tried to use any of those techniques in trying to predict wave heights resulting from a tsunami?
So I didn't quite catch what techniques. Did you say machine learning?
Yeah, machine learning, yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so I mean, we're looking at some techniques that are sort of related to machine learning techniques in relation to how do we take a large set of earthquake simulations and try to filter that down to a smaller number that we really need to run on a fine grid, for example. So one way of dealing with this high dimensional space is to use what's sometimes called sort of a multi-resolution or multi-fidelity Monte Carlo method, where you do some simulations on a very coarse grid, more simulations on a somewhat finer grid, and only a few simulations on a really fine grid, and then try to combine those somehow. And if you have lots of simulations on the coarse grid, or if you have other data that you can easily measure from the earthquake data itself, for example, how much uplift there is of the seafloor, or what the total potential energy that you inject in the water is, those things should be correlated perhaps with how bad the tsunami is. And those are things we can calculate directly from the seafloor deformation without running the tsunami model at all. So we're looking at ways of sort of figuring out how can we use the information that's cheap to compute in order to predict things. And so some of the ideas for machine learning come out of that. In terms of just sort of brute force taking data and trying to apply machine learning without using tsunami models at all, I guess one of the problems is that even though we've had several of these big tsunamis in the last decade or so, they're still pretty rare, and there aren't that many events where there's a lot of data that can be put into a general sort of algorithm like that. And in particular, for any particular subduction zone, there's a huge range of patterns of slip that might happen, and all we've seen from the recent big events is one particular earthquake on a few subduction zones. So if you base everything only on the data that came from those, you'd probably be very misled about what the probabilities are for the future.
Okay, thank you.
More questions? So So Randy, I have a question.
Yeah.
About the adjoint method. If you're so you're essentially solving a hyperbolic system backward in time.
Right.
So if the signal that your final condition came from started off smooth and then developed a shock, how do you go back in time?
Right. So yeah. So what we've done so far, anyway, with the adjoint is only look at the linearized shallow water equations. Essentially, actually, we're solving the nonlinear equations, but we're primarily interested in the propagation of the ocean in terms of what waves are going to reach a particular point. And the propagation on the ocean is essentially linear because the amplitude is typically less than a meter on several thousand meters of water, and the wavelength is very long, so you don't get any shock formation, and it's basically a linear problem. And for our adjoint, we're solving using the adjoint of the equations also linearized about that ocean at rest. If you want to apply the adjoint to a nonlinear problem, so for example, if you were really trying to model flow coming onshore, and you wanted to look at some point that doesn't even get wet until the tsunami has arrived, and we're trying to use an adjoint method there, then the adjoint is really, it's a linearization about a particular forward solution. So you'd have to solve the forward equations and then keep that whole history of the forward equation, and then the adjoint would still be a linearized system of equations, but it would be linearized about that particular depth of coming out of the forward solution at each time. So that would be a lot harder in many ways. You would have to first solve the forward problem and keep the whole solution in order to linearize about it, and then if you were trying to determine something, like solving an inverse problem using the adjoint as a way to estimate sensitivities or something, you might have to go back and forth between the forward and the adjoint as you adjust your parameters, for example. So that's a harder problem. It's possible, but it's luckily for what we're interested in, at least in sort of identifying waves propagating across the ocean, you can just look at linearized about the ocean at rest, and then the adjoint equation is always the same and independent of the forward solution.
Thank you.
Okay, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Okay, so this is a very interesting presentation. I'm curious about the simulation that you're running. With the wave propagation, you have reflections from the sea coast. So accompanying with the wave propagation, your sea level going to be rising. My question is, how do you treat this moving boundary condition?
Right, so the moving boundary of the coast is really handled by the fact that grid cells can be either wet or dry. And so we need special Riemann solvers sort of to handle interfaces between wet cells and dry cells and whatnot. But that's all been kind of working for some time fairly robustly so that we can handle inundation as the water moves onshore. It just wets cells as it moves in, and then as it moves back out again, the cells dry out. And if the depth is below some tolerance of 1 millimeter or something, we set it to 0 again. So we're not trying to move the boundary or solve the equations in a domain with a moving boundary, but instead we just have ways of handling interfaces between wet cells and dry cells, and for determining when cells become wet and when they dry out.
So that means the boundary, you just fix the boundary, is that right?
So the boundary, in a sense, the boundary is, we're looking at a domain that maybe goes all the way up across the Cascade Mountains or whatever, so that at the boundary there, the water never reaches it. But the boundary between the wet cells and the dry cells is just dynamically determined in every grid cell. Of course, there's also boundaries out in the ocean, typically, where we have to cut it off at some point. We're not solving on the whole ocean, so there are ways that have to leave the boundary without generating sort of spurious reflections at the boundary. But these finite volume methods, there's a reasonably good way that handles sort of absorbing waves at the boundary. It's something else that Chris and I have been looking at recently, are better algorithms for absorbing boundary conditions, especially for these seismic problems, where it turns out to be a problem in some issues, some cases. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, second question is, can you share your slides with us? It's very interesting.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. We'll post them. I think somebody is making a web page for this series, and I think it's also being recorded, and the recording will appear there if it works.
That's correct.
Appreciate it.
Well,
Thanks for coming.
if there's no more questions, let's thank Randy again.
Thank you all for coming.
All right, so we'll stop the recording. Thank you very much, Randy. And as Randy said, the talk will be posted, and you'll all get an email about how to access that in the very near future. Thank you.
Thank you.